Hello, my name's Ulurotimiosha. I like to talk about American presidents, and I also discuss US laws and international human rights law. It's March the 9th, 2026. It's been over a week since the joint US Israeli decapitation strike, taking out the leadership of the Iranian government, and just recently, the uh, the successor of Iran's supreme leader, Ayatollah Ali Khamenei, was announced that his son. It's been announced that his son is succeeding him as supreme leader. Um, However, what I want to discuss today is um, I'm continuing with my discussion on the consequences of war, since America is at war with Iran. Um, of course, I've done videos discussing the legality. According to international law, the war is illegal, but we're clearly in a new era, right, where might is right, in sort of like a jungle era, uh, you know, just harking on, the realpolitik as, demonstrated um, by Germany, the 19th century Germany under its Chancellor Otto von Bismarck. I've done videos discussing what realpolitik is. Um, a few days ago, on March 6, 2026, on Friday, President Trump used uh, a phrase demanding the unconditional surrender of Iran. He posted this on Truth Social. And unconditional surrender, that phrase, maybe many people don't understand. People who don't understand, who are not so familiar with US history, that phrase is very evocative. It's evocative of the Second World War, when President Harry Truman used uh, the same phrase in his July 26, 1945 Potsdam speech, demanding that Japan, surrender unconditionally, right, or experience utter, uh, prompt and utter destruction of its civilization, right? So, of course, Japan wasn't aware that America had the atomic bomb. And so President Harry Truman had, warned Japan to surrender unconditionally. So President Harry Truman used the same phrase, demanding the unconditional surrender of Japan's military. Uh, and he gave them a condition that if they didn't, they could they would witness a rain of ruin from the air, unlike uh, no other ever seen, on the earth. Of course, that reign of ruin would be the dropping of atomic bombs, first of all, on Hiroshima on August 6, 1945, and then Nagasaki on August 9, 1945. The combined effect led to about 246,000 deaths, most of them civilians. And of course, there was a fallout of radiation, continued radiation, defoliation, and deformed uh, birth defects, and the cancers, the carcinogenic effects of radiation. Japan did surrender on August 15, 1945. So when President Trump used that phrase, demanding the unconditional surrender of Iran's military forces, it made me wonder that, is, President Trump intending to drop atomic bombs on on Iran. Of course, this would be unconscionable in this era that we're in. But I like to watch. Um, I watched. Let me see. I've been watching a former CIA analyst who was CIA officer who was a whistleblower. His name's John Kiriakou, and he made a statement claiming that President Trump, you know, went struck the way he did because if he hadn't, Israel was actually planning on using, nuclear weapons on Iran. Of course, that would be completely unconscionable. But anyway, and the military strategy of President Trump, people have wondered if he's going to put boots on ground. And sometimes I say foots. It's boots on ground or feet on ground. They've been wondering if President Trump intends to put boots on ground, and he's expressed his reluctance. Now, the terrain of Iran is totally different from Iraq. Remember, uh, Iran, the region is very different, and of course, the Iranian military, their Revolutionary Guards, they're masters of that terrain. It's very likely that since they engage in asymmetric warfare, they will defeat U.S. troops, right? That would be American, just America walking into a snare, right? Because one, the Iranian military will be fighting asymmetrically, right? And they might use chemical or biological weapons. Because I found it interesting that the uh, Iranian foreign minister had mentioned, not, their representatives, right? Their spokesmen have mentioned that Iraq used chemical weapons against them during the Iran-Iraqi war uh, between 1980 and 1988, and they indicated that it was America that supplied them that technology and the materials for the chemical weapons that were used against them. So it's likely, Iranian scientists are very advanced. It's not even clear if they probably have nuclear weapons right now. President Trump claimed they were 2 weeks to actually developing nuclear weapons. But the real possibility that the U.S., the joint U.S. Israeli forces might use nuclear weapons on Iran, it's a very disconcerting prospect. Just considering the phrase that was used. Um, Again, there's no binding agreement stopping the U.S. from using nuclear weapons, right? In the past, the U.S. did not use nuclear weapons against USSR during the Cold War because of MAD, mutually assured destruction. So it was, the possession of nuclear weapons served as a deterrent because if either party used nuclear weapons, the other would retaliate in kind and the whole world would be destroyed. So, trying to stop Iran from acquiring nuclear weapons is futile because no nation is actually going to use nuclear weapons. Nations possess nuclear weapons in this age as a deterrent, right? Iran is again has over a civilization of over 5,000 years. So it's not a suicidal civilization. It's regardless of the defamatory remarks about who the government is or whatever. They're not trying. They're trying to survive, and the use of nuclear weapons, right? If they possess nuclear weapons and they use them, it's certainly going to guarantee their destruction. So, because of mutually assured destruction, nations that possess nuclear weapons do not use it, right, against another nation that has nuclear weapons. So it's just a deterrence, right, to stop another nation that possesses nuclear weapons from using it against them. Um, but other than that, there's no binding law. America has no binding law prohibiting it from using nuclear weapons, all other than a moral obligation. It's just a moral obligation. Yes, in 1963, President Kennedy signed a limited test ban treaty, but that test ban treaty just it just obligates the U.S. Not to um, detonate nuclear weapons in the atmosphere or under the sea. So that's what it is. But the U.S. is not a signatory to the treaty on the prohibition of, prohibition of the use of nuclear weapons. The U.S. is not a signatory, so the U.S. has no law. There's no law uh, binding the U.S. and binding it from using nuclear weapons. It can use it. It's uh, it's it's a moral obligation, right? It's a moral obligation that constrains the U.S. But so far, the U.S. government has not shown. Uh, it's not shown. The other thing is that there's the international law on armed conflict, right? International laws of armed conflict, which is jus in bello, right? I talked about jus et bellum. Jus et bellum is justification for going to war. But we've already violated jus et bellum, justification for going to war, because we didn't have justa causa, right? We didn't have suffer any imminent threat. We weren't striking Iran in the decapitation was not in self-defense. We weren't invaded. There was no imminent threat. Imminent means it's going to happen right now. So a preemptive strike is not something that's imminent, right? That's long term. So it's actually also academic. It's theoretical. It's abstract. We don't know if it's actually going to happen. It's just and it's contingent, right? So what is imminent is not it removes contingency, right? So it's something that's on its way about to happen right now. That's what imminent threat is. Um, and there's nothing stopping it, right? So so the United States hasn't shown restraint in terms of adherence to um, jus ad bellum. That's justification for war. So once it's gotten into war, it's not likely to follow jus in bello. That's international laws, uh, you know, around armed conflict. Um, so that's a challenge because President Trump has indicated that he doesn't intend to put boots on the ground again. Boots on the ground puts our soldiers at risk. Um, it puts our soldiers at risk because Iran fought almost a decade of war with Iraq and it prevailed, even though Iraq was supported by through weapons and materials and intelligence funding by the United States and the USSR, the two superpowers. But Iran still prevailed. So Iran, that's just not too long ago. That's just we're talking about just about 40 years ago, 30 something years ago. And so Iran is still um, you know, battle tested and it understands its terrain very well. Its military forces have a mastery of their terrain. And of course, as scientists, our soldiers will be vulnerable to the wiles of its scientists. You can't um, we can't say that Iran will not use chemical or biological weapons on American soldiers uh, if they're boots on ground in Iran. Um, and with boots on ground, it would limit America's and Israelis' airstrikes because our men will be there. Uh, this was what you know we suffered in Vietnam, right? During the Vietnam War when American forces soldiers went to a, we sent over the period about 3 million people, and at some point I think we would have as many as over 500,000 soldiers right there in Vietnam, but they didn't know the terrain like the Vietnamese, right, fighters, and so they outwitted, you know, had the edge over America's soldiers since they had a mastery of the terrain, and that will be what American forces would experience as well, with boots on ground. So, so that's my concern. The concern that the United States would end up using nuclear weapons, since President Trump used words that's unconditional surrender, which evoke the same words that President Harry Truman used on July 26, 1945, as prelude to dropping bombs on Hiroshima and Nagasaki to end the World War. Of course, his rationale was that um, you know to limit the agony and sufferings of American soldiers who are dying. War again is terrible. The Second World War, by the way, is still the deadliest conflict mankind has ever been engaged in. About 85 million people died in that war. What's ironic is, even though 85 million people died, only about 20 million, right, uh, were actually military personnel that died from armed conflict. So two-thirds of those 85 million were actually civilians who died. So two-thirds died because of famine, starvation, and genocide. So there are many terrible consequences, right, that result from war. During the Second World War, people died of starvation. Two-thirds of the civilian, in the 85 million people that died, two-thirds of the deaths were civilians, right? Of course, there are bombings, there are sporadic, indiscriminate bombings of civilian populations, right, which happen. Um, there's starvation because the governments they create what's called the wartime production economy, so in which they reorganize the entire economic base to support the military effort, right? Taking it away from consumer production, that's including food. They start rationing, and they start to, prioritize sending food and supplies to the soldiers, to the front. And the men go to war, and they instead, all the factory production, everything is focused on building weapons, whether it's armored tanks, whether it's planes, it's guns, weapons, bombs, grenades, whatever. The whole production is geared towards building more weapons, you know, to support the war efforts. And during that time, people die. And of course, war exacerbates racial animus, because the worst in mankind comes out. So there's lots of genocide, a lot of what instigates civilian deaths, casualties, is also genocide. Of course, during the Second World War, there was the genocide that occurred against the Jewish people. 6 million people were killed in the genocide. In the First World War, there was an Armenian genocide where about 1.2 million Armenians were killed. Nigeria's fought a civil war. In Nigeria's civil war between 1967 and 1970, there was a genocide of the Igbos, in which about 2 million civilian Igbos died from starvation, right? I've actually met an Igbo woman who, she was a child at the time. Her mother just given birth to her, and she's smaller than the rest of her family because she was the firstborn. She said her mom, they were staying, they were sheltering in um, where livestock, where they kept livestock, because they were trying to hide from soldiers and the bombs, because they were civilian population, and she'd just been born. But she said they had been so starved, her mother's body could not make milk. She didn't. That's why she was small. So her mother's body couldn't make milk, so she was malnourished. So this is what happens during war. Again, there's genocide. There's the genocide that had also occurred in Rwanda during the Rwandan Civil War between 1990 and 1994, when Hutus killed about 1 million Tutsis within 100 days. Civilian population. It just massacred the civilian population. So this can be expected. There's already some kind of animus, right, going on, and President Trump is talking about encouraging the Kurds, the Kurdish population in Iran, to get into some kind of separatist movement. And so this can trigger genocide, a civil war. And so this is what happens during war. And, war is not it's always supposed to be the last resort. So I'm just hoping that, I'm a historian, so I'm just talking about, I'm not, I'm not siding one side or the other, I'm not supporting one side or the other because I'm an American. But at the same time, I'm a humanist. And, war, I'm just pointing out the atrocities that occur during war. And, you know, I've not talked about the drafting of a draft can occur during the war. The last time the U.S. had a draft was in 19. The last authorization for a draft expired 1st July 1973 during the Vietnam War, and so the last draft that was called up was December 1, 1972. So a draft can occur, and young people, men, could be called could be drafted um, into the military if there's a full scale ground invasion of Iran, again, which would just be putting Americans in harm's way, because we can't guarantee that Iran is not going to resort to the use of chemical and biological weapons to defend itself, because war is ugly, right? They're fighting for their survival, and given President Trump's concerning use of the phrase unconditional surrender, the same, which is, again, is evocative of what President Harry Truman said on July 26, 1945, demanding the unconditional surrender of Japan, or they would experience a prompt and utter destruction of their civilization, of their people, and they would suffer a rain of ruin from the air, unlike has never been seen, witnessed by mankind on the earth, right? So this is, and that was, him warning about, his intent to use the atomic bomb if Japan failed to surrender. Now, the difference between Harry Truman's use of the atomic bomb and, you know, President Trump's demand for an unconditional surrender just less than 2 weeks into the war with Iran is that America was not the aggressor in 19 in the Second World War. America was defending itself. Japan was the aggressor. This time around, America is the aggressor. America is the one that has violated international law. Um, we violated uh, jus et bellum. We didn't have any justification for going to war. So America is the aggressor in 2026. Hopefully, there's not going to be a third world war. Um, so I just thought I should, talk about the horrors of war and the words that evoke the 1945 use of the destructive nuclear weapons. The only time nuclear weapons have ever been used in armed conflict in the world, and unfortunately, it was used by the United States. So hopefully, America doesn't do that again in this war conflict with Iran, which America instigated. In any event, I'm going to stop here and I will continue with the consequences of war, my discussion on the consequences of war. My name is Uluru Timosha, and I will keep you posted. Thank you.